So, Jonathan, let's talk a little bit about taxes. There is a and we should say that this process of the budget and then the tax cuts has been rather opaque. It will continue to be opaque, it seems to me. It is opaque for a number of reasons, not the least of which because the Republican Party is determined to get these tax cuts without any support from Democrats, because the tax cuts are going to end up going to the richest amongst us, and Democrats, at the very least, nominally, don't appreciate such a thing. And so we have this very arcane procedure that is going to allow them to have a 50+1 vote. It involves rolling in their budget, which cuts from any number of programs into the tax cut bill. So we don't really have a full sense of what this is going to look like, even after the announcement, even after they voted on it in at least the budget in many respects. However, what we do know is that there has been a long time push. And this actually goes back, and I want you to talk about this, back to the mid-aughts, when I think both of us were still at Air America, when George Bush pushed a plan called the American Jobs Creation Act. There has been a long time push to so-called repatriate profits that American companies are keeping offshore so they can avoid paying taxes on them. They're just sitting there waiting in a garbage scow off the coast of the United States to come back to America. And we've got to let these dollars come back to America so they can bring goodness here. Talk about the American Jobs Creation Act. I think it was of 2005, if I'm not mistaken.
It might have been 2005. I thought it was 2004, but it certainly took effect regarding the 2005 tax year. And yeah, they brought back something like $2 trillion, $1.5 trillion, something like that, and paid a rate, not the going corporate tax rate, which they all said was absurd and ridiculous, but 5.25% was the rate of taxes that they paid on all that money, some of which, of course, wasn't even earned overseas, but they had just sort of worked their books or done inversions where their corporations were headquartered overseas for tax purposes, so that even if some of the money was earned in the U.S., on paper it was earned overseas, so now they could pay a 5.25% tax rate on it. And the language in the bill, let me back up. So we actually just did some reporting at TYT where we talked to members of the Council of Economic Advisors and the National Economic Council and the Joint Committee on Taxation. We talked to people who were in on that process, that legislative and policy process, before it got done. And they said at the time, beforehand, these are Bush economic people now, remember, they said at the time, either I don't think this is going to create jobs or this is not going to create jobs. And they
so there were two options.
Go ahead, sorry.
It's unlikely that it's going to create jobs, or it's definitely not going to create jobs. And we should say that obviously it was sold to the American public as the American Jobs Creation Act. The argument was it's going to create jobs. And what's fascinating about...
I don't know where you come out with that. Well, I guess some people read into that.
Well, and what's fascinating about your reporting is, if I remember correctly, George Bush, only months ago, came out and claimed that he got duped, that he was told this was going to create jobs. And presumably, he must have been just listening to the folks at like Hewlett Packard who were pushing this and not his own economic council people.
Well, it turned out, we found out that he did have some skepticism about this thing beforehand, but it seems to have been based primarily on the idea that you shouldn't change the tax rules on income that's already been earned. In other words, that's not fair is the idea, that it shouldn't be grandfathered in that way. But I do think that the Bush administration, to Bush's credit, I think had some degree of skepticism. And so the language of the actual bill did say this is to be used for this, not this, not this. Well, it was used for this, not this.
So in other words, it was supposedly
no enforcement mechanism.
It was supposedly these tax savings supposed to be used to create jobs or go into R&D, and it ended up going just to stock buybacks or to dividends for shareholders.
As well as executive compensation. But yeah, the lion's share certainly was buying back shares of the company's own stock and paying out dividends to investors. Just gave it away to the folks at the top.
And, let's go back even further, because what people seem to think is that somehow this is a tax burden on these companies. My understanding is that following that, the reason why corporations are allowed to wait until they repatriate profits made overseas, wait to pay taxes on these profits until it's repatriated, was because the Eisenhower administration wanted to encourage U.S. corporations to build markets, to build a presence overseas, and that this was a way of encouraging them to invest overseas. So what was given to them initially as a tax break is now a complaint that they need to rid themselves from. So here we are again, and we should say, and we've got to take a break in just a moment or two, but we should say that as much as this has become a Republican policy and as much as associated with the Bush administration, which it should be, this was during the run-up to the election, and I think this is a rather unreported story of the run-up to the election. Chuck Schumer was bragging that I think as late as October that he had Clinton and Ryan and Schumer, for some reason he was referring to himself in the third person, to come together on a tax repatriation scheme where overseas profits would be brought in to this country ostensibly to fund, at least in part, an infrastructure deal. Now, we heard Bill Clinton, I think, was on CNBC in the run-up to the election, echoing these sentiments that these corporations were going to get a tax break as a way of funding a large infrastructure deal. People can argue back and forth as to the merits of that particular policy, but this notion of giving corporations a break on their taxes that are on money that has been sort of, I guess, shuttled away overseas is not exclusively a Republican idea. But let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the reporting that you've done at TYT Investigates on Lockheed Martin and their supposed arguments about this need for this repatriation tax break. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to Jonathan Larsen from TYT Investigates.